Hi, I'm Mark Madison at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of Conservationists in Action. Today we have somebody fairly different for us. We have Randy Olson with us this afternoon. He's out here also helping us teach a course. And Randy Olson has a Ph.D. In marine biology from Harvard University, and then he was a tenured professor and threw it all away and decided to become a filmmaker and science communicator in many different ways. So Randy, welcome to NCTC. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Wonderful to be here.
And I gave kind of a sketch bio of yours, but tell us a little more about your background and in particular why you decided to switch from being an academic to a filmmaker.
I get asked that a lot. People say, how in the world can you go from being a professor of science all the way to becoming a filmmaker? And my general answer on that is that the unifying principle of the two disciplines is storytelling. And as I look back now, I see that that's pretty much what drew me in both fields. When I was 18 years old, I dropped out of college, ended up working on an oceanographic project in Puerto Rico. And the scientists I worked with there were such amazing storytellers that they kind of hypnotized me into going into this entire profession. And had a wonderful time for about 15 years, ran around, did a lot of research, and ended up with a whole bunch of stories to tell. And as I got going, giving lots of talks and telling those stories, drew me eventually into filmmaking in the early 90s. And then I began making my own films and winning some awards from that and realizing that I really was fascinated with that topic, particularly the challenge of how to reach the general public with this fairly technical information. And eventually by 1994, right when I received tenure at the University of New Hampshire, I decided it was time to make the big jump. So I left then, moved to Los Angeles, kind of jumped into the belly of the beast, went to film school at the University of Southern California, moved into Hollywood, and been living there for 16, 17 years now. And went through film school at USC, the graduate production program, 3 years, which was wonderful. It was the best possible introduction. And then got out, kicked around for a few years, making some films in and around Hollywood, working on some films. And then some of the science colleagues of mine from previous career began tracking me down and saying, look at what's happening with the world's oceans. Is there any chance we can use some of what you learned in filmmaking to help communicate some of this stuff to the broader audience? And that led to us creating a project in 2002 called the Shifting Baselines Ocean Media Project, which I'm still running today. That's been a partnership between ocean conservation and Hollywood filmmaking resources, with me kind of in the middle as the linchpin. Which eventually led to a couple of feature films, Flock of Dodos, the Evolution Intelligent Design Circus that I made in 2006, and then Sizzle, a global warming comedy. And all of that came together in my book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, Talking Substance in an Age of Style. There you go.
Great.
That's the whole rundown.
Well, this evening we're going to screen the film out here, belatedly. And I thought we'd show the audience the trailer so they can get a sense of what a global warming comedy might actually look like. So let's run the trailer, and then we'll talk a little about Sizzle after that.
Great.
We're making a film about global warming.
Right. Oh, I can talk to you about that.
Tell us about global warming.
Oh, man, it's hot as a mother.
What does it take to make a good documentary about global warming? You need smart producers.
This is what I want to ask you. As a scientist, when is this all supposed to evaporate?
You need a respectful cameraman.
Randy, I'm not trying to, just interrupt or anything, but I think it's a scam, man.
You need a celebrity host.
Okay, Christina Ricci ran away from us.
That was not good.
Lucy Liu can really slap people.
You need a good title for the film.
Smokey and the Planet.
When Harry Met Extinction.
Honey, I Shrunk the Glaciers.
You need a director who gets on well with his crew and is both brave and confident. And you need a clear consensus on the issue.
Do you think that the planet has warmed over the past 100 years?
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
Yes.
Overall, it has warmed. However,
It is being overblown and exaggerated.
We are approaching another ice age.
Join Dr. Randy Olson in the summer of 2008 as he tries to make a documentary about global warming.
you call me a bitch?
I'm talking to Mitch. This is ridiculous.
80? 80 Patterson.
We really want to make this film, and we feel very, very passionate about global warming, and we're very, very upset about it.
Yeah.
We just don't know why we're upset.
I'm so mad! I can't take it anymore!
It's a very funny film and very thoughtful.
Not in the opinion of some people.
That's true. It's humor is subjective, so you take a risk doing that. But
very much so.
Actually, in that little trailer, is oddly enough from two of the more comedic actors in the thing. Some are real people, some aren't. The talking heads are all real. My expectation was, but there's a profound statement from one of the producers about we want to feel that this is an important issue, but we don't know why we feel that way. And it's poorly paraphrased, but there really is an important point to that, isn't there? I mean,
that's probably the single most profound piece of the entire movie is when Mitch, the producer, turns to me and says, we're really, really worried and really upset about global warming. We just don't know why we're so upset. And that is so relevant to the vast majority of the American public on a lot of these things. And you know, after we did that, I began thinking it was a lot like the banking scandal. It was the same thing. People were really, really upset and worried about the banking scandal. They just didn't know why. They couldn't understand what was going on. So many of these problems in our society today, they're so large and complex, and you can intuitively feel something's going wrong, but you just intellectually can't quite grasp exactly what's happening.
Before I go on to the next question, I'd just like to remind folks, this is live. Randy's actually here. God bless him. All the way from California. And so if you do have a question, please don't call Randy's personal cell phone. But if you do have a question, we have phone numbers and emails when you can contact us to ask Randy a question about environmental filmmaking or marine biology or anything else that comes to mind. A question that comes to mind for me, why did you choose comedy as a means to communicate the importance of global warming?
I don't know. It's kind of happened that way from the beginning. I think the answer is that a lot of what I talk about in my book, that storytelling involves these human elements.
Yeah.
And all you got to do is look back to the Greeks. You know, they figured it out early on when they talked about theater. What did they use? They had these two masks. One was smiling, one was frowning. That represents drama and comedy. Those are the central elements that the broad audience really does connect with. And as soon as you lose those two elements, when you've got no humor and you have no emotion in what you're stating, you're conveying, you end up with a very narrow audience. And there is an intellectual audience out there that will listen to you just through information, but it's much smaller than the bigger, broader audience. And so I think instinctively I've been interested in trying to understand this dynamic of broader communication and coming to this realization that without humor and emotion, you're not reaching the public.
You do something clever in the film, and that you have a lot of talking heads. I don't recall how many you have, maybe 10 or so.
I think about 6 on each side.
6 on the art. So you have a dozen talking heads, and yet you mentioned the book, and you just mentioned now tension's important. How did you add a little tension for the talking head interviews as opposed to having just the single narrator and so on?
Well, the origin of that, it's kind of fascinating. I hope I don't go on too long with this answer, but I made a first movie, Flock of Dodos, that's about the controversy over the teaching of evolution and intelligent design. And in making that movie, we had very limited budget, and I wanted to interview 6 or 7 of evolution friends of mine, evolutionists, and knew there were a bunch of them around Cambridge. I did my graduate work there at Harvard, knew some folks there. So when I came there, I teamed up with one of them, Steve Orzak, and we came up with this idea of, instead of doing 7 sit-down interviews, what if we got a bunch of these guys together, especially old friends of mine that used to play in this poker game that we would have when I was a graduate student, and what if we did a round of playing poker and let everybody just sit there and in between rounds of cards talk about the issue? That was all we had in mind, was a gentlemanly discussion. When we filmed it, what ended up happening was some fairly heated debate, as well as all of these academics around the table pontificating, talking down their nose about all these stupid people and this issue of intelligent design and yada yada. And we ended up intercutting those scenes through the movie, and that was my first real experience with reality TV, which after we were done with it, I began to realize in the screenings, oh my goodness, we've got this element of reality TV where we have all the sit-down normal interviews with scientists, and those are very controlled things. When you're watching somebody behind a desk being interviewed, you know exactly the bounds with which they're going to operate. But then you cut to this poker game where these guys are getting mad at each other, and there's actually, you begin to believe there's a chance one of these guys could punch one of the other ones. And wouldn't that be amazing, you know, to watch 2 professors fist fighting across the poker table? That starts to make things interesting and lively. And that's one of the things you got to think about in terms of using this medium to try and get people interested in it. So that ended up being the most powerful dynamic of the movie. When you read the reviews that were written, they all come back to that poker game, basically being a behind-the-scenes look at the dynamics of a bunch of academics, the way in which they view the world and talk about it. And it was so powerful that it changed my whole perspective on filmmaking. And then, so then people started asking me, you know, we enjoyed Dodos. Global warming is such an important issue. Couldn't you make a movie, a Dodos type movie for global warming? And for about 2 years, I kept saying to everybody I'd love to, but you know, the initial premise of Dodos was that my mother lived next door to the biggest lawyer for intelligent design, and she doesn't live next door to any climate scientists, so I don't have an angle to this thing. And then I went and saw this amazing movie called Borat. And that was a life-altering experience. And what I saw in Borat was the hybridization of two genres. So that movie is this cheesy, schlocky, predictable narrative of a buddy picture of two guys traveling across the country and having eventually a big fight. They wrestle naked, things like that. And so the overall structure, the arc of that movie is very much scripted. But then within each of those scenes, it was largely unscripted. They, you know, created all these different events that were real people. And that fascinated me. And then I began thinking about that, and I came up with the premise that you've asked about at the core of Sizzle, which was, what if we interviewed experts and had on our crew one of our cameramen actually be a plant, basically, a stand-up comic, who would also be programmed as a climate skeptic. And halfway through this interview, he would interrupt what was going on there and start arguing with my guy that I'm interviewing. And from there, we'd just take it, you know, unscripted and see what happens. And we actually did a trial run of that, being a good former scientist, knowing to do a pilot experiment before you scale something up to a huge budget. And I brought over this poor, unsuspecting postdoc from USC, Doug Pace, good buddy of mine, was working in Antarctica. And I told him, you know, we were doing this little trial run. I want to see, you know, how this crew would work. And so he came and talked about his research in the Antarctic, and we did the whole thing. And halfway through the interview, all of a sudden, the cameraman, Alex Thomas, jumps in and starts arguing with him, saying, you know, I think this is a scam what you guys are doing. You're just doing this to make money for your research, blah, blah, blah. And I turned to him, started arguing with him. Next thing I know, drag half the crew out in the hallway. We have a shouting match out there, all of which was play acting. And we came back, and then we finished the interview, and I apologized to poor Doug. And then came the moment of truth when I led him out into the parking lot. And finally, I had to find out, you know, was he on to what we were doing? And so I finally said, you know, I want to apologize for what my cameraman did there. And he said, oh, you know, don't worry about that. This is a very heated topic, but, you know, more importantly, what did you think of my answer to your third question? You know, did I nail it with that answer? I couldn't even remember what we were talking about. But that was the moment that made me realize this dynamic in this art of interviewing people, that when people are getting interviewed, they go so much into the zone that they are in tunnel vision mode, and you could start a fire on the set and the whole crew would scramble, but the person trying to give his answer would probably hang in there still trying to give the answer and going on. And that turned out to be true. We did a dozen of these interviews, and of the dozen interviews, there was only one guy who for one moment sort of suspected something. And I got to say, that was the guy who I would consider to be the guy who has the biggest trouble with the truth. That's as much as I want to say on it. But basically, you know, takes one to know one is what it comes down to. But otherwise, nobody else suspected anything. And we had a lot of fun doing it. The one thing, the crew wanted me to really go to the hilt in this thing and have it get out of control and start insulting the scientists and calling them names in hopes that we could get the scientists red-faced screaming at us saying, get out of my laboratory. And then we could have that in the trailer, and that could have really, you know, made for a film that would have gotten us a huge audience if it had been that crazy and outlandish. Right. And I constantly had to tell the crew, you know, I'm really sorry, but I kind of have a reputation to maintain here. If we do one of those, that person will get on a blog and say, don't anybody ever work with this guy again. And, you know, there were other ways to get what we wanted. So, in fact, what happened was the stand-up comic, Alex Thomas, turned out to be just a super nice guy. And there was nothing mean and nasty coming off of him. So when he did these interruptions, it was actually kind of humorous. And the thing that we ended up learning that's in the movie was a completely different dynamic, which was when he interrupted and started asking questions from his knucklehead perspective, we got a different personality out of the scientists being interviewed. And they showed that they had the ability actually to talk to the broad audience, but that when the questions were coming from me with my academic voice, what comes back from the scientist is an academic speak language. And that makes you realize a lot of times, somebody says, oh, that guy was boring on camera. Yeah, but maybe the person interviewing him did a really bad job. It was the wrong person interviewing him. Had you brought in somebody that would bring out a different dynamic, you could have gotten. You begin to realize how much personality is such an interactive process like that.
That's very true. And I also noticed when he interrupted during the skeptics, they seemed more comfortable. Because I think they suspected you were not particularly sympathetic to them, except for those that were very slick communicators to begin with, and it didn't really matter.
Well, I'll tell you something, this is very relevant. You asked the thing about humor and comedy. So last Friday night on Bill Maher's show, Real Time with HBO, or on HBO, he talked about this. He had a comedian, Mark Madison, on the show, and they were talking about Air America, that radio station, and how Mark Madison got fired because the people running that, it was a liberal station, they just didn't get his brand of humor. And Bill said, this is the problem with so many of these environmentalists. They are so uptight and rigid, and that is the absolute damn truth, and it is a handicap of the entire environmental movement. And my movie ends up being a manifestation of it because it got rejected from at least 4 film festivals, 4 environmental film festivals. No environmental film festival ever ended up showing it or even expressing any interest in it. And I think there was a general feeling that there's no place for comedy in this topic of global warming. And they can all bite it. That's all I can say to them. Them and their failed movement, and that's what's at the core of it, is you can't be humorless and expect to get a broad audience to support what you're doing. You cannot, in our society today, do that. And by the way, 2 weeks ago, we showed this movie in Doha, in the Republic of Qatar, at the World Congress of Science Journalists, to about 200 of these delegates, most of whom are from Africa, and they just loved it. They just roared with laughter all the way through. I think half of them didn't understand a word of the movie. They just knew that there was a whole bunch of funny black people and funny gay people and a stupid scientist who got raped by a polar bear and went dancing, and his mother ended up going dancing at the hip-hop club. And, they enjoyed it, and then they picked up the message at the end, which is that we've got a serious problem here with climate change, and by the way, we're failing to communicate effectively enough to create any sort of mass movement. So that, it all comes back to your first question about humor is absolutely essential, and if you ain't got that, you aren't going to connect with the broad audience.
And there is a serious message to the film. It takes a change in tone in the last third.
Is there a more serious topic today than climate change?
Yeah.
And this is one of the troubling things, is that Al Gore made this movie that was massively flawed, but I still applaud him and the people behind it for getting out there and doing something at least and starting to take the lead. And my advice to the environmental community is keep supporting Al Gore to just get better with what he's doing. They did a crummy job with that movie, but what really kind of got me was a lot of the people behind it who put out this message that this is the end of the world potentially, it's the biggest crisis we've ever faced, and within a few months they'd all moved on to other topics. And, if this was really that important, why aren't you still pushing it? But the one guy that did stick with it is Al Gore, and he's getting better. That's all you can say. And he's not Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, but so what? He's more like the tortoise in the hare, and he's the tortoise that's just still plugging away, and they're about ready to do another thing that shows that they're learning as they go along, and that's probably the greatest hope for eventually making a breakthrough with getting a big audience behind this, is just persevering.
Yeah, and you do have a funny take, I'm not going to spoil it, in the film about people jumping from topic to topic, which happens in the midst of your film. And that's actually very amusing. But humor is underutilized, and you were too kind to say it, but one of the film festivals that rejected it apparently was the one we host here in Shepherdstown. Well, we'll try to remedy that in the future. But you've got your revenge. You're here now.
Exactly.
But you mentioned in the book, and once again, this book has a lot of good advice for communication. One of our critical issues, not just among scientists, but also among federal and state conservationists who have to do a lot more of this.
Let me say one thing on that topic exactly, because I mentioned in the book, one important experience for me, moved to Hollywood with a blank slate in '94, knowing nothing about that world, had all kinds of horrendous experiences. The first paragraph of the book is a solid paragraph of profanity from my acting teacher the first night I was in the class and got confronted by this horrible woman who for 2 years berated me. But one of the things I mentioned in there is that first year I worked on this $30 million feature film with Patrick Swayze, and at one point I got to work as an assistant to the casting director. And I was also just started this acting program. And so I was fascinated how acting works, yada, yada. And then one day they brought in a bunch of major actors, male leads for one of the supporting roles. And And I got to sit in the waiting room with them and chit-chat with these guys. And so I began asking them, you know, I just started this acting class, and I would say, what do you think is the very best acting class to take? You know, if I could only take one course, I was hoping they'd say my course. And what came out of them was shockingly identical. One person after another, they all said there is no one course you can take for acting. To learn the craft of acting, you need to take a whole suite of courses. They're all going to hit different parts. They're all going to be filled with a lot of opinions on this is the way acting works. And slowly over time, you will take away several principles from each of these things, and out of that you will synthesize a greater, broader understanding of what the whole craft is. But if you think you're going to have one person that's just going to be your mentor and teach you everything, you're going to end up, you know, very non-functional. And I'd say the same thing about, and by the way, communication and acting are pretty much one and the same. Yeah. You know, it's no coincidence the greatest communicating professor or president we ever had was a former actor, Ronald Reagan. So it's the same basic principles. That's the core of my book, is built around that. And towards that end, you know, I don't care if anybody buys the book or reads it, but it really is in that suite of books that you read to try and figure out broader communication. This one is different because there's, as far as I know, never been somebody who went the whole distance as a scientist and got tenure, so they thoroughly understand the academic world and got all the NSF grants and had the graduate students and all that sort of stuff, and then reprogrammed himself as a filmmaker, not just by making a few films, but actually going the distance of the USC Cinema School, which, you know, in itself is a marathon. And it means that I am this alien creature that has gone and done something that nobody else has done. So if nothing else, it's worth listening to what I have to say, just so you can discount it. Like, this guy really needs, you know, psychological help. He's been so damaged from his life experiences. But it's a matter of putting it into that whole suite of different voices on how to communicate.
Yeah, it raises a question. Those with a science background, how important is the accuracy of your message versus the efficacy of your communicating it?
Oh, yeah.
How do you weigh those two? And you do talk about that quite a bit in here.
Oh, yeah. And therein lies the dilemma. And, you know, the starting point has to be that you have to seek accuracy first and foremost. And interestingly, the subtitle of the book is called Talking Substance in an Age of Style. So it was published in 2009, and one of the reviews that got published with it was in the New Scientist. And the reviewer there honed in on that, and at one point said that scientists should be cautious about what I'm saying there because I'm advocating bending the science to tell a better story. And I read that, my eyes bugged out, and said, where did you get that from my book? And I ended up writing a letter to the editor that they published in there, in which I set the record straight. On page 111, I say verbatim that I would never support anything short of the 100% accuracy in the communication of science. But it's fascinating. It's very telling about how this substance versus style dynamic works, because what that says to you is that that person, along with tons of other science people, read the book, and here's what they got. You know, they were given, in the substance of the book, it says 100% accuracy, but the style of the book is filled with a lot of humor and emotion. And those things send informational signals which say, who cares about accuracy? And generally, that's the way they're translated. And it meant that those people, as they read the thing about 100% accuracy, said, yeah, he's just saying that because, you know, more importantly, he's so funny about, he's so irreverent. And anybody who's irreverent couldn't possibly really value accuracy. And that's just simply a handicap. And I think they're absolutely right in you know, that is sort of a critique of it. That's the fine line you have to walk. And it's true, you know, you get up to talk to a group of very serious scientists and they'll give you a minute or two in the beginning to have some humor, but once you get into the substance of what you're doing to this group of serious scientists, you'd better get rid of the humor and the emotion. And it's like back when I was a research scientist, and occasionally I would get sent a manuscript to review of serious heavy-duty science for a journal, and some schmuck would try and put a joke in there, or even worse, start getting emotional about the loss of resources or something like that. And you realize there's no place for humor and emotion in this clinical language of science. And, you know, I still adhere to that and talk about that in the book. You're going to make a mess of the profession of science if you start to tell journal editors, it's okay to let people, you know, get emotional about their, you know, I'm so passionate about these cells that I study. You don't want that, because those are from the lower organs that I talk about in the book, and they bring with them noise. And so that's the trade-off. And in the science world, you want this language that's cold and clinical and doesn't have that noise in there so that things can be efficient. And this, in the end, is just about understanding these two different modes of communication, the academic mode versus the broad mode. That's fundamental difference.
Good answer. Now, I think, Randy, do we have a question? Yeah, we have a question.
Cool. Bring it on.
Oh, you just now coming in on me? Okay. Randy, after watching Sizzle, do you feel that you wish you had a chance to redo it because now you have even further proof with Haiti? Or is it just kind of vindication?
Wait, further proof of what?
Of how the global warming really affects the poorest of countries and the poorest of people.
Oh, interesting. You know, we didn't really... yeah, that is kind of woven into the third act of the movie. You're right. The initial concept with the movie Sizzle was it began with my dear and close friend Ifeanyi Njoku, who plays the sound man in the movie, and for 15 years he and I have been best buddies in Hollywood. We've been through all kinds of battles there. And I came up with that initial idea of these crazy interviews, but then he recruited Alex Thomas, the stand-up comic that he's worked with for a long time, to do it. And together he and I crafted this whole story. And in the beginning, that actually was meant to be the really specific message. Ifeanyi's from Nigeria. His father's a very prominent engineer, architect there, and is actually friends with Kofi Annan and some other people like that. So we were going to make this thing into a searching for Kofi Annan type of journey where he and I were going to go to Africa and try and find Kofi Annan and present the question to him about, you know, don't you people feel cheated by the developed nations that have caused this problem? Now you're all paying the price for it. But we didn't have any money.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you make movies. And when you do crazy things, no one will give you any money to do anything novel and adventurous. So I paid for this whole thing out of my pocket, $120,000 or so. And that constrained what we were doing. But what did end up actually happening in the real world that's in the movie is we ended up interviewing this woman from NRDC. And in talking about that, we brought the topic up about developing nations and the premise that a lot of the right wing has presented, which is that wealth is health, and all we have to do is make everybody wealthy, and then they'll take care of their people. And then her reply was, yeah, why don't you go to New Orleans and ask the people from Hurricane Katrina here in the wealthiest nation if this country's done a good job taking care of them. And, you know, it bowled me over when she said that. In this instant, I thought, God, she's absolutely right. And that's what we ended up doing in the movie is we went for the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, went down to the lower 9th Ward, found a bar that we went in there and started talking with the local people, and then just pulled a group together for a storytelling session, basically. And I wish we could have done more, but it's just a small sample of how painful what those folks had gone through. And it was put into the movie simply to illustrate this dynamic that even the wealthiest nations aren't that well prepared that they can do a good job taking care of everybody in these disasters. And as a result, as one of the other guys in that New Orleans segment says, a fellow who lives there, lost his home, he said, I want my government to start thinking about this stuff because it's clear from Katrina they're pretty bad at it. So, it's about thinking through what's coming. And, let's just look at this summer right now with all the mess that's going on with climate stuff, whether or not it's being caused by human effects, who knows, but regardless, we're getting a ton of it. And our government's really able to help their people out in this sort of thing. And I think that's where it ties back to Haiti, is that is the same situation there. And you're right, the developing nations really are not equipped to cope with this.
Right. I would just like to add a footnote. All of the $120,000 is on the screen.
Painfully so. You have no idea.
Let's go back to the book a sec, and we'll show a film clip in a minute that talks a little about this. But one of the cogent points you made, and I think it applies to those of us that work in conservation too, is it's one thing to have an important new concept or theory or idea you're trying to get across. It's another thing to make it accessible to people. And I think a really effective anecdote you gave was shifting baselines. And maybe we'll show the little film clip because it's very fun. And then you can tell us a little about the history of how this idea emerged. So we'll cue that up right now.
Hit the mother load today.
You've got to be kidding. Do I even need the gauge?
I haven't seen fish this big in years.
Okay, it's not this bad, but fishing today simply isn't what it used to be. Almost 1/3 of U.S. fish stocks are overexploited, threatening the future of sport and family fishermen. Yet at the same time, our government is proposing to weaken necessary protections. This shouldn't happen. Please call your local member of Congress before we end up like this.
You think of what I'm thinking?
That was a funny clip. As an avid fisherman, I could commiserate with that gentleman.
Once again, there's a lot of fishermen that don't agree with you at all. And in fact, that's what happened. It infuriated a lot of the fishing community.
They can't take a joke.
I don't blame them. Now, in a nutshell, what happened with that thing was in 2002, 2003, and 2004, a bunch of conservation groups on the California coast tried to do a mass communication campaign about marine protected areas that are being put in the California coast. They bungled everything they did. Over $1 million was spent. It was all thrown in the garbage can, which happens with a lot of these environmental communication campaigns. And by 2005, there was nothing happening. And so I called up a few friends and said, you know, given that nothing's happening, that my friends in the fisheries world are telling me that these things are coming, whether the public knows about them or not, we got nothing to lose. Why don't I make a PSA that is going to generate some angry controversy, at least getting people talking about this? Right. So that was the genesis of the thing. And the one thing I knew is that there's nothing fishermen hate more than the idea of somebody holding up a stringer of minnows and saying, I had a good day. So yeah, I made that with a couple actors from the Groundlings Improv Comedy Theater. Actually, the game warden is Cedric Yarborough from Reno 911, Deputy S. Jones.
Yeah.
Great. Recognize him? Yeah, he was wonderful. We had so much fun shooting that. And that was one of the few films I've ever had enough budget to shoot it the right way. So we did it. We released it, and nothing much happened for about 3 or 4 months. And then all of a sudden on Christmas Eve that year, it got aired in the Central Coast of California, where they were right in the middle of beginning to deal with this issue of taking away all these fishing grounds for the fishermen. And all of a sudden on their blogs, everything erupted, and they started calling names to me and the thing and everything else. They started calling my office and shifting baselines, leaving these horrible, who's behind this thing? Who put up the money? Blah, blah, blah. So I got in touch with some of them eventually, and I said, look, I'll make a deal. If you guys will pull together 5 of your top fishermen, I'll come up there with a crew, and we'll sit down and let you guys tell your side of this issue, and we'll make a video out of it, which is what we did. It was called The Tiny Fish Reply, and we put it on the website. And in general, people really like the idea that we've got these two pieces of media, one that plays to one side, one to the other. At least you can see the two perspectives. But there were some environmentalists that just thought it was atrocious that I would allow these fishermen to put all their nonsense into a video, blah, blah, blah. Again, this is part of the dynamic of effective communication. You've got to show some respect to the other side and give them a chance to have a voice, even if you don't agree with it. So that was the origin of the whole thing. And yeah, since then, it's fun, and it's had a long shelf life. It still works, and the reason it still works is because it's not literal-minded. It's not somebody standing there itemizing the facts. It works because it's set in the world of storytelling, and it tells a broad, simple, fun story of fishermen that, in the future, blah, blah, blah. That is the power of storytelling, and that's what I'm spending a lot of time now because of my book, working with lots of different groups and trying to help them to broaden out their thinking, which leads me to my topic du jour, if you don't mind we talk about, which is the unbelievable campaign that the Centers for Disease Control put together about 2 or 3 months ago it's titled the Zombie Preparedness Campaign. And so I just, this morning, on my website called thebenchy.com, posted a whole long piece I've written where I interviewed the people behind this thing, and I'm telling their story of what went on. And to me, it is a textbook case of applying the principles of my book. Not that they'd even read my book, but they just intuitively did the same things I'm advocating. So here's what happened in a nutshell. They had this topic of preparedness for disasters. And every year they would try and do a little communications thing around June 1st, the beginning of hurricane season, trying to tell people, you need to put together your disaster preparedness kit, blah, blah, blah. And they had materials for them. And it was just a tough thing to communicate. How do you get people interested in something that hasn't even happened like that? So it's never been an easy topic for them to communicate. All of a sudden, this year, in May, a couple of the people were having a discussion, and somebody mentioned that they were following Twitter about the Japan tsunami, and somebody made some mention of zombies. And next thing you know, there was a whole, little blip on the radar screen of everybody talking about zombies. So these guys came up with this idea. What if we tried to attach preparedness to the idea of being prepared for a zombie attack? You'd need the same basic materials to deal with a zombie attack as you would for a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake, blah, blah, blah. Right. So they did a trial run. They made a short little blog post. They put it on a Monday morning, and not much happened for a day and a half. And then all of a sudden, the wife of a guy who's one of the top experts in the country on risk communication spotted it, sent an email to the head of the whole CDC, just said, this is amazing. And he forwarded it to the folks behind the thing, and that was the green light. The next morning, they put it on Facebook and Twitter, and by mid-morning, they'd gotten over 30,000 responses that crashed their server. By the afternoon, Fox News called them up and said, is this a hoax or did somebody hack your website? Because people were talking about zombies on your website. And they said, no, we've done this intentionally to generate some interest. And then the New York Times the next day wrote a whole article on it. And the bottom line is now, 2 months later, they have their news analysis service, media analysis service, gave them a figure of over $3 million in free media exposure they scored through this one little idea, and compare that to how much they spent on the campaign, which they totaled up as $87 they spent on this one simple little idea. And then 2 days ago, after I interviewed one of the guys and started my article, he sent me an email and said, guess what? We just got nominated for 5 Platinum PR awards, some big award in the world of public relations, for this campaign. And this is so important. Everybody needs to take this to heart in this sad, boring climate communication community that has done such an inept job and squandered so much money, at least $350 million, and is devoid of exciting, interesting ideas, devoid of anybody willing to take a chance on anything. Here is a couple of individuals here at the Center for Disease Control who pushed the system a bit, came up with this crazy idea, tested it out, and then launched it. And just through that one idea, it goes on and on, the consequences now. All these state and local agencies are reaching out to them now about, we want your zombie preparedness kit materials, yada, yada, yada. That's the power of a good idea. That's the power of creativity. And that's the problem when you get a movement like what's happened with the climate thing, when there's been just a complete vacuum of creativity and willingness to innovate. And, my crazy movie Sizzle becomes the proof and point. I make this movie and, just got completely snubbed by that whole community. It's done fine with lots of other folks, but again, rejected from all the environmental festivals. And more importantly, it got a great review in Variety, the most important magazine in Hollywood. It got Cinema Source called it brilliant filmmaking. But then, of all people, Nature magazine decided they needed to review it, and they called it unfunny. Climate comedy falls flat. And that's been a lot of the response from the science world, which is, this is just not the right way to communicate these things. And by the way, that's what happened to the CDC people. They got a certain number of sticks in the mud, the very literal-minded science people coming at them, saying, this is not the right way to do this. Even last Thursday, when I was there running this workshop, one of the top science people pulled me aside and said, I still don't get it. It seems like a lot of hot air. Do we really have to stoop to this level of attaching our serious messages to zombies? And my answer is, you better believe it. We live in this massively competitive communications environment today. You have two options. One is to stick your head in the sand and stay the course and do your same old boring stuff you did 30 years ago. And the other is to figure out social media, to figure out the competitive environment and just do better than everybody. And by the way, that's the bottom line with these climate skeptics. We don't live in a repressive environment where we can send these people off to gulags if they talk out against the mainstream science of climate stuff. You have to deal with that, and the only solution is to communicate more powerfully and effectively than they do, but that's not going to happen if you're not innovating. End of my story.
Oh, that's very good. It's a nice segue to why you're here. You're here, not in this room right now, but you're here to help us with a course.
To provoke.
Yeah, yes, that too. But it's a course we offer on resource implications of effective communication for global climate change. And we're trying to ramp up as professional conservationists our messaging. So I wonder, since you're going to teach this tomorrow in a workshop and a broader classroom presentation, why you think it's important that conservationists be able to communicate a message properly. Can't we just hire people like you to do it? And also, any tips you might have for better ways to do that?
Yeah, so communication is ubiquitous. You know, you have to accept that. There is no profession that doesn't involve communication. Right. And there are a lot of people saying, well, I don't want to get involved with communication. I'm sorry. You know, no matter what you do in the science world, even if you're a hired laboratory technician, at the end of the day, you've got to communicate what you did to somebody. This was one of our kind of shocking realizations in graduate school. Maybe you went through the same thing. You know, we showed up, these innocent little kids, to do a Ph.D. in biology. And in the beginning, we thought all you did was just gather some data and, you know, write it up and publish papers. Then we started finding out you have to go to science meetings and stand up there and talk about it. But not only that, you start to realize there are these people that are really good at speaking, and they do crummy research, and they end up with enormous crowds at the science meeting. And we would sit in the back and say, didn't anybody here read the rotten papers this guy wrote? You know, why is everybody here so excited? And, you know, we used to refer to them as dog food salesmen. And you got to be a dog food salesman in this world. That's what we've come down to. I'm sorry. And you got to attach your thing onto zombie preparedness to reach that audience. And there are ways to do that responsibly and ethically and to not get involved in all kinds of craziness. And you got to do it slowly and carefully and cautiously. And the starting point is to learn what these basic communication principles are. And by the way, and this could be a whole nother segment, which is storytelling is so important, so fundamental. And it is at the core right now of one of the biggest problems the entire research science world faces, which is this innate preoccupation with positive results, with positive patterns, and this disinterest in negative results. We don't want to hear a story about a guy who sat at home all summer. We want to hear a story about the guy who took a journey and went somewhere and did something. The same basic thing happens in the science world and in the biomedical world, and it's a big problem. There was a great article in The Atlantic last fall called Lies, Damn Lies in Medical Science. And it's about how much noise there is now in the biomedical world because everybody will fund studies to figure out something new that causes a disease. Nobody wants to fund you to go out and kind of fact check on the last study that was done and the accuracy stuff. That's all underlain by these basic human principles of storytelling that you learn best in the humanities, in the world of literature. And this is one of the reasons why the science world has got to eventually pull their head out and realize they need to support the humanities as well. You can't just create science in a vacuum away from the humanities because once upon a time, actually, there's proof now that scientists did evolve from human beings. And if you track it back, you find that they actually converged once upon a time when scientists were also well versed in literature and the humanities and things like that. And even though there's been this divergence, there still are all these vestiges that we see, and it's important to realize that therein lies the dynamic of communication. And that's why all of these folks, especially in conservation, need to learn these things. One of the fascinating experiences for me is I wrote this book. I mean, first off, I made 2 movies. And one thing I learned is that academics cannot understand movies. You can't communicate them through movies. It's too much of a non-literal medium. It blows all their fuses and they don't get the message properly and they get all upset and angry. That's for the broad audience, movies. But finally, when I took my message, which is that there's a problem with science communication, and I put it in the form of a book, which is a much more literal medium, finally, a lot of scientists did sit down and read the book and wrote nice reviews for it in Science and Nature and places like that. And most of them seem to have pretty well gotten it when it's finally kind of written in their language. But, you know, you need to know what these basic principles are. But the fascinating thing for me was that I wrote the book thinking it was for research scientists and environmentalists, you know, the world that I've worked in. And still there are a bunch of bloggers and things like that so many of those people are so deeply ingrained in this idea of, well, I just don't know. You know, I'm not sure. They can't go 100% with anything. Say, yeah, that's it. They have to say, well, you know, I'm holding off judgment. But what's happened is in the world of public health and medicine and even biotechnology, in all those areas that are much more tightly integrated with the public, particularly public health, a whole bunch of people from there read the book and reached out to me and said, we get it. You know, this is what we do day in and day out. And the best of all those people has been the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. So last August, they brought me there for a day, and it was a match made in heaven. And they have hundreds of communicators there, and they don't question the need to communicate to the public because that's their mission. And as a result, they have a whole TV broadcast studio there, and literally hundreds of people involved with communication. And as a result, I've been back there 3 times now doing workshops with them, as I was last week. And those people really, really get it. And that's why this zombie preparedness thing is just the manifestation of how much they get it. And again, the climate world has got to look at that, got to look at these public health people and realize that, and no, you can't dismiss it by saying, oh, well, public health's easier. People relate to that. No, you need to look at this disaster preparedness thing, the idea that this was a topic that nobody could communicate very well for a long, long time until somebody brought some creativity into it. And that's the way you're going to fix some of these and solve some of these problems. And yes, climate issues, every single damn one of them can be communicated to the entire public. They can all be motivated if you'll bring in some genuine creativity, but that has not happened, and that's why you've got such a mess with it right now, in my opinion.
All right.
Are you taking notes?
That was a brief answer, yeah.
Exactly.
Let me play devil's advocate, because we're an agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, that doesn't have an overt communication mission, although obviously everything we do is dependent on communicating. And climate change has been added to our plate relatively recently. So I'm a wildlife biologist. Climate change is affecting my endangered species. And I know how to quantify those results and publish those results, but I don't necessarily see a story in that because I haven't been trained in narrative storytelling. Do you have advice? I mean, your stories are fairly interesting. One had to do with your mom's proximity to an attorney, and the second story is really multiple stories woven into a funny tapestry that has a serious end. But if you're talking, most of our agency, or a large percent of our agency, is biologists, and then they communicate via quantification, via academic papers. How do you get them thinking about stories? They're probably not going to be able to come up with the stories like you've come up with, and they may not have a natural bent. Oh,
don't say that. You know, do not say that. I was on a panel discussion in Norway in January this year, and it was a big communications symposium thing. And you know, the Scandinavians are the nicest people in the world, and I think they have an unwritten ethic, which is when you do a panel discussion, nobody disagrees with anybody. You know, you have to all just say, "Oh, that was a great point," and furthermore, blah, 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 which is wonderful and nice. But after the second panel, I couldn't help myself, and so one guy said in there, at one point, right near the end, he said, you know, I do think that we have to accept that there are some topics that simply you cannot get the public interested in. And that's where I drew the line. And furthermore, you know, I wrote an essay in which I said there ought to be like a Hippocratic oath for communicators, which is, you know, the doctors say, first do no harm. For communicators, there needs to be this basic oath that you take, which is that you accept that every subject could be communicated. The only thing that keeps it from happening is that you're just not that good. And I believe that myself day in and day out. And when I look at something again like that zombie preparedness thing, I just, you know, bow and humble and saying, I'm not that good. You know, those guys are really that good. And you have to use that as a starting point, that every single boring little project you're doing on bryozoans living on the undersides of rocks on the rocky coast, there's a way to get people interested in that. You're just not good enough yet at doing that. And in the movie, you know, one of the great characters in there is Dr. Naomi Oreskes, historian of science, and we bring her in towards the end of the movie, and she ends up being the character that tells us to go to New Orleans. But part of the way she does that is she says, you know, you've been obsessed with interviewing scientists for this documentary. No, you need to find the human face of this issue. And therein lies the challenge for every person involved with everything is day in and day out, they should be asking themselves, what is the human face? You know, I'm studying these little butterflies out in a field. There is some human way in which to connect to it. And by the way, you know, that rockets me back to my science career and all my frustration of writing NSF grants, in which they always said, you know, you need to figure out how this research is of value to everybody in our society. And I worked on these obscure little blobs called sea squirts, and turned out, you know, I studied their ecology, but they had some chemicals in there that some people thought might cure cancer. So eventually, every dumb proposal I wrote began with, I'm studying something which could cure cancer, and which is nonsense. But, you know, I began to realize that is the dynamic, and you've got to figure out how people's human nature works as a starting point. And, you know, you're not going to beat it. The best thing you can do is figure out how it works and try and work within those constraints. And again, coming back to the zombie preparedness, they understood that everybody's interested in zombies, and why not use that to get them interested in these other elements of preparedness?
It was very timely. There were a bunch of zombie TV shows and some popular movies.
Exactly.
And I went to the site. I saw it weeks ago. I mean, it was quite a phenomenon, the number of email links that were sent around.
And there's still staggering around in shock, that they didn't know that this was going to happen. And now they're getting all this add-on stuff. They're making a zombie graphic novel comic book that the Institute's supporting them to do. And apparently there's some 5K run in Baltimore where there's zombies that chase the runners, and those people reached out to the CDC saying, can we tie in our run with your zombie preparedness stuff? All this stuff can lead to just mushroom clouds, but it begins with the creativity, with that innovation and that idea. And again, if you're not fostering that at the very beginning level, then it's not working. So to get back to your question about what can folks do in terms of this stuff, the first chapter of my book, we begin with the core principle that I took from my acting class, which is when it comes to reaching the broad audience, there's 4 organs in your body. They're important: your head, your heart, your gut, and the sex organs. The object of reaching the big broad audience is move things out of your head into your heart with emotion, sincerity, into your gut with humor and intuition, and if you're lucky enough, all the way down to the sex organs with sex appeal. The further down you move it, the bigger your audience gets, and conversely, if you're given a presentation, you have nothing sexy about it, you have no humor in it, you have no emotion in it, you're ending up with just a tiny little sliver of the very analytical people, which, they'll listen to whatever you have to say, as long as you have a lot of information in there. And therein lies the challenge. So that's the thing for people working on trying to reach a bigger audience with what they have to say. It's about these non-literal elements. Information is very literal, but these lower organs are non-literal, and the more you move down there, the broader it gets. But then the challenge comes back to you about, can you broaden it out and yet still keep it accurate? And you can. The way you do that, and this is the bottom line, is you have to allocate more time, money, resources to the effort. And that's what you run into, especially with a lot of the environmental groups. They just say, we're really worried about these issues, but we have no budget for communication. Right. Well, then you're not going to communicate effectively. You just have to prioritize it at some level. And the same with the science world. And they're realizing that. In recent years, science organizations are putting more emphasis on communication as they begin to understand that they're getting beaten in the broad market of communication.
That's a good explanation of why, even though we think things are important, other people don't, which seems to be the point of your book. We assume everybody's interested in the death of fishery stocks and global climate change, but they actually aren't instinctively interested in
the term I put on that a few months ago was science home movies. And remember home movies, long ago, the parents would shoot all this footage of their kids at the park and riding their first bicycle and then invite all the neighbors over to watch this footage. And after 20 minutes, everybody's sound asleep and begging to go home. And the parents can't understand, why didn't you guys want to sit and watch this stuff? And it's the same deal. It's that idea of, you may be passionate about your topic, but unless you're telling a story, most of the rest of the people aren't. And yet, that is the magic and the power of storytelling, is if you can figure out your boring home movies and wind it into some story, all of a sudden everybody in the neighborhood would love to look at your home movies. That's why the storytelling thing is kind of the be-all and end-all, and it's the 3rd chapter of my book. And I think that it's been part of my journey, is that I thought it was one of many things early on. In film school, they tried to pound it into our head, that nobody's going to want to watch your movie unless you're telling a good story, for the most part. There's a few exceptions, but in general. And then I had to learn the hard way. I got out of film school. I made a low-budget comedy movie that was a terrible script, didn't tell a story at all, and it was painful, and it was a disaster. And then with Flock of Dodos, the first feature that I wrote and directed, I shot it, and for 6 weeks it didn't tell a story, and it was painful. It was a disaster. And then finally we cracked the nut and found a simple little story to hang the whole thing on. And as soon as it turned into a story, magic happened. All of a sudden, everybody was willing to sit through it, and actually they weren't suffering by the end of it. And by the way, final message, that's the problem with Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. It doesn't tell a story, and it's not a piece of media with any sort of long life to it. It's not anything anybody wants to watch more than once. That's the tragedy of what happened with that. It's 5 years later, and it's one of my standing jokes on college campuses. How many of you kids want to get together tonight and have a beer and pizza party and watch the Al Gore movie? And they go, and that's a shame, because imagine if that movie had somehow, some way, been so funny, so fun, so interesting, so emotive, so totally engrossing that it was something people want to watch over and over and over again, then that really could have been something to create this mantra about, we got to do something about climate. And that's where I believe this mass media, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it's a really central part of these campaigns.
Have you ever seen an environmental film that people want to watch multiple times? Or that you would be willing to watch multiple times?
Yeah, but let's not get into that.
Besides Sizzle.
Cane toads, but that's not really
Cane toads is a wonderful film.
Wonderful film.
A painless way to learn about invasives.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
exactly.
I've seen that. That is That's
there are movies that you can do that with. It's about storytelling, and you know, it's the arouse and fulfill principle that I introduced in the beginning of the book. If you can effectively arouse people's interest on the topic, then they'll actually reach out to you for information. And both of my movies are light in information, and as a result, they've been beaten up by a fair number of academics. You know, with Flock of Dodos, there are a number of evolutionists that said, we had hoped you would make the case for evolution. Well, that's not what film is for. It's not very good as a literal medium. It's not good when you burden it with information. It's a great tool of arousal. And so what we do with both of my movies is I go to college campuses on what we call the Sizzling Dodos college tour, and I show up there and we show Dodos, and then we follow the 85-minute movie with a panel discussion of 2 or 3 of their professors in not just evolution, but also communication and journalism and even theology sometimes. And what you find is at the end of 85 minutes of my lightweight movie that gets people interested, aroused on the topic, they're actually desperate for those 4 people to come out. It doesn't matter how boring the academics are, they are so needed at that point that people, they're great. You know, the whole audience has been pre-aroused for them. And we have time for one last little sample, or are we out of time?
Yeah, we do.
Let me give you one final thing, which is another thing that I'm so impressed with that embodies the principles of my book. It's a program called the Hollywood Health and Society Project that was created by the Center for Disease Control 10 years ago. They reached out to USC, the Norman Lear Center for Entertainment Studies, and said, we'll give you a bunch of money if you will do 2 things. Start putting our public health sheets out to all the primetime TV writers and do follow-up when they put one of these diseases into a TV show and see, you know, what people retain from this. And so one of the things they ended up doing, one of the prime examples that gets used in these workshops, is there's a soap opera called The Bold and the Beautiful, and they made a public service announcement for that by itself is one of the worst public service announcements ever, because all it is just an actor standing there talking to the camera saying, if you have HIV, AIDS, you need to get tested and do this, that, and the other thing. And if you watch it by yourself, you say, who would ever want to watch that? It's just pure fulfillment. It doesn't have the arousal part. But what they did was they had this 6-week story arc in the soap opera where one of everybody's favorite characters got diagnosed with HIV, and right at the most emotional moment in the whole thing, they cut to, you know, commercial time, and they come on with this public service announcement of that actor speaking to the audience. And the CDC got the biggest response ever, over 5,000 calls the next day on their hotline, everybody wanting information, blah, blah, blah. That's how you partner this stuff in the arouse and fulfill principle. You find somebody else out there who's already got the arousal audience going, and you stick your message in there if you're not that good at the arousal part yourself. And that's it. You know, that's where I try and partner my, quote, arousing movies with the fulfillment people, because I'm not that sharp on evolution, climate stuff, and I need the experts to be there as a panel discussion after my crazy movie.
That's great. That's a great example to go out on. Thank you again, Randy. I really appreciate it. We've been speaking in a very quick hour with Randy Olson.
Blah, blah, blah,
he's made 2 feature-length films, A Flock of Dodos, The Intelligent Design Evolution Circus,
yes.
and Sizzle, a global climate change comedy. His book is called Don't Be Such a Scientist, Talking Substance in an Age of Style. So thanks again, Randy. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you again next month.
Thank you.